I'm Aiden Mori, 28 years old, and everything changed when I walked into my family's dining room that October evening and announced I'd just purchased a condemned building in downtown for $400,000 0 cents. The silence that followed felt like standing in a vacuum, watching my mother, Dr. Lillian Mori's fork freeze halfway to her mouth, my father Kenji's engineering mind visibly calculating the financial catastrophe I just described, and my sister Celeste setting down her wine glass with the deliberate precision of someone preparing to deliver a death blow. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that subscribe button and join me as I share how what everyone called financial suicide became something none of us saw coming. The Mori family dinners had always been exercises in measured disappointment, but that night felt different. My parents had spent 35 years building their reputation in our city, my mother saving lives as one of the top cardiologists at Metropolitan General, my father designing the structural frameworks that held up half the downtown skyline before his retirement. They'd raised Celeste and me to be logical, practical, to make decisions based on research and careful consideration. Celeste had followed that path perfectly, graduating from law school, marrying Nathan Winslow from another prominent legal family, buying a pristine $2,300,000 0 cents penthouse in the financial district through what she called smart networking and strategic patience. I had spent 3 years after graduating with my architecture degree working 60-hour weeks at Morrison & Associates, living in a studio apartment, eating ramen 4 nights a week, and saving every possible dollar toward this moment. $400,000 0 cents represented every sacrifice I'd made, every weekend I'd stayed home while friends traveled, every date I'd declined because I couldn't afford dinner at the restaurants my peers frequented. The building I'd purchased was the old Paramount Theater on 5th Street, a 1,920s masterpiece that had been condemned by the city 6 months earlier for what the official paperwork called extensive structural damage and safety violations. I'd driven past it every day on my way to work, watching the plywood boards cover more windows each week, seeing the red condemnation notices multiply like a disease across its limestone facade. The real estate listing had been buried on page 7 of Commercial Properties, described in language designed to scare away anyone with sense. Buyer assumes all liability for demolition costs, environmental remediation, and city compliance fees. Property sold as is with no warranties or guarantees, inspection access limited due to safety concerns. Most people would have seen those words and moved on to something safer, something that made sense. I saw them and felt something I'd never experienced before, a certainty that went beyond logic or careful consideration. Celeste was the first to break the silence, her laugh cutting through the dining room like a blade. "You're financially suicidal," she said, not bothering to hide her amusement. "That building has been condemned for good reason, Aiden. The structural reports are public record. The foundation is compromised. The electrical system is from the 1940s, and the city inspector who condemned it said it would cost more to renovate than to tear down and start over." She pulled out her phone, scrolling through what I assumed were the same documents I'd already read. "Nathan and I looked at that property 2 years ago as a potential investment. Even with our connections and resources, we walked away. The numbers don't work. They never work." My mother finally set down her fork, her medical training giving her the composure to ask practical questions even when her child had just announced financial ruin. "Aiden, honey, did you get an independent structural assessment? Did you consult with a contractor about renovation costs? Did you even have a lawyer review the purchase agreement?" Each question landed like a small cut, not because they were meant to hurt, but because they highlighted every step of due diligence I'd skipped in my rush to secure the property. My father leaned back in his chair, his engineer's mind already working through the mathematics of my mistake. "The demolition costs alone will probably run you another $100,000, he said quietly. "Environmental cleanup for a building that old, especially a theater, could be twice that if they find asbestos or lead paint. And that's assuming the city even gives you permits to tear it down, which they might not if there are historical preservation issues." The weight of his expertise made every word feel heavier. This was the man who had spent 40 years calculating load-bearing requirements and stress tolerances, who had never made a professional decision without triple-checking his math. Watching him explain the financial impossibility of my purchase felt like being diagnosed with a terminal illness by someone whose medical opinion you couldn't question. Celeste continued scrolling through her phone, finding new ammunition for her case. "The building inspector who condemned it was Graham Elwood, and he's been with the city for 15 years. He doesn't make mistakes, Aiden. When Graham condemns a building, it stays condemned. His reports are thorough, his recommendations are conservative, and his word carries weight with the Planning Commission. She looked up from her screen with the expression she probably used when explaining legal realities to clients who didn't want to hear them. Nathan and I know Graham through the Chamber of Commerce. He's coming back for a follow-up inspection next month to determine whether the building should be demolished by the city or if the owner will handle it voluntarily. Either way, that building is coming down, and you just bought yourself a very expensive pile of rubble. The conversation continued for another hour, circling through variations of the same theme. My parents asked increasingly detailed questions about my research process, my financial planning, my backup strategies, each inquiry revealing another gap in my preparation. Celeste provided legal context for the various ways this decision could destroy not just my savings, but my credit, my career prospects, and my relationship with the family. Nathan arrived during dessert, still in his suit from a late client meeting, and within minutes had pulled up city records on his tablet, showing me the previous owner's failed attempts to secure renovation permits, the accumulating fines for code violations, the paper trail of a property that had been systematically rejected by every level of municipal oversight. As the evening wound down and I prepared to leave, my mother walked me to the door with the careful movements of someone trying not to disturb a fresh wound. "We love you, Aiden," she said, her hand on my shoulder, "but we're scared for you. This feels impulsive in a way that's not like you, and the consequences are so severe." My father joined her in the doorway, his usual goodbye hug replaced by an awkward pat on the back. "You need help with the demolition costs," he said, "or if you want to cut your losses and walk away, we'll figure something out. But please, don't throw good money after bad trying to save something that can't be saved." Celeste called out from the dining room where she was still researching property records with Nathan. "Graham Elwood's inspection is scheduled for November 15th. When he comes back and confirms what everyone already knows, maybe you'll finally listen to reason." I drove back to my studio apartment that night with their words echoing in my head, the weight of their disappointed love pressing down on every breath. $400,000, 0 cents of my life's work, committed to a building that everyone with expertise and experience said would destroy me. The building inspector's follow-up visit was 3 weeks away, and according to my family, that visit would seal my fate. They were all so certain about what Graham Elwood would find, so confident in their assessment of my mistake. None of us had any idea that when the city inspector came back, nobody would be laughing anymore. The first time I stood inside the Paramount Theater after signing the papers, I understood why everyone thought I'd lost my mind. The main auditorium stretched before me like a cathedral of decay, with water stains blooming across the ceiling in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like some tragic form of art. Plaster had fallen in chunks across the red velvet seats, many of which were missing entirely, leaving behind rows of metal frames that looked like the skeleton of some massive beast. The stage was warped and buckled, the hardwood planks separated by gaps wide enough to lose a foot in. But above the destruction, suspended in the darkness near the ceiling, a single piece of the original 1920S stained glass caught the afternoon light filtering through a broken board. Deep blues and golds swirled together in an intricate pattern that depicted theatrical masks. And for just a moment, I could see what this place had been, what it could be again. The building's electrical system had been shut off for safety reasons, leaving me to navigate with flashlights and the occasional beam of sunlight through missing boards. My footsteps echoed differently in each room, from the hollow boom of the main auditorium to the sharp crack of debris underfoot in the lobby. The original marble floors were still intact beneath decades of grime, and when I found a section I could clean with bottled water and paper towels, the veining was so beautiful it made my chest tight. These were the details I tried to focus on during those first few days, the glimpses of grandeur that reminded me why I'd taken this impossible risk. I needed those moments of beauty because everything else about the building seemed designed to confirm my family's warnings. By the end of my first week as owner, I'd already spent $12,000, 0 cents, on basic utilities and permit fees, watching my savings account shrink with each transaction. The gas company required a complete inspection before they'd restore service, which meant hiring a certified technician who took one look at the basement and quoted me $8,000, 0 cents, for bringing the system up to code. The water service reconnection revealed a leak in the main line that would cost another $4,000, 0 cents to repair. Each day brought new discoveries of things that were broken, missing, or actively dangerous. And each discovery came with a price tag that made my stomach clench. My parents' anniversary party the following Saturday felt like a trial where the verdict had already been decided. 38 years of marriage, celebrated in their perfectly appointed living room, surrounded by their friends from the medical community, the engineering society, colleagues who'd known me since childhood and were now learning about my spectacular financial mistake. Celeste had arrived early to help with preparations, which apparently included briefing the guests on my situation, because the questions started before I'd even gotten through the receiving line. "I heard about your building purchase," said Dr. Harrison, my mother's longtime colleague, his tone carrying the careful sympathy usually reserved for terminal diagnoses. "That's quite an ambitious project." Mrs. Yamamoto from my father's former firm was more direct. "Kenji mentioned you bought that old theater downtown. Are you planning to flip it?" When I explained that I intended to restore it, her expression shifted to the polite confusion of someone trying to understand a foreign language. Celeste had brought Nathan, and together they held court near the appetizer table, fielding questions about my decision with the patient expertise of lawyers explaining a particularly complex case to confused clients. I caught fragments of their conversations throughout the evening. Historic properties are notoriously expensive to renovate. The permitting process alone can take years. Young people sometimes mistake ambition for planning. Nathan had prepared what seemed like a presentation, complete with statistics about commercial real estate failure rates and case studies of similar projects that had bankrupted their developers. He delivered this information with the kind of professional courtesy that made it impossible to argue with, each fact presented as helpful education rather than personal attack. The worst part wasn't the questions or the statistics or even the carefully worried expressions on my parents' friends' faces. The worst part was the silence that followed my attempts to explain my vision for the building. When I described the potential for restoring the theater as a community cultural center, people nodded politely and changed the subject. When I mentioned the architectural significance of the 1920s design, conversations moved on to safer topics like home renovation projects or vacation plans. By the end of the evening, I felt like I'd spent 3 hours trying to convince a room full of adults that monsters were real, while they humored me with the patience reserved for delusional children. I started sleeping in the building the following week, partly to save money on rent, but mostly because I needed to understand what I'd bought. My studio apartment lease was up for renewal, and the $1,800 monthly rent felt like money I couldn't afford to waste when I had a building with shelter, even if that shelter came with holes in the roof and a heating system that hadn't worked since the Clinton administration. I bought a camping mattress, a sleeping bag rated for cold weather, and enough battery-powered lanterns to create small islands of light in the vast darkness. The building made sounds at night that I hadn't noticed during my daytime visits, settling creaks and shifting groans that spoke of a structure adjusting to decades of neglect. On my fourth night in the building, I was jolted awake by sounds that didn't belong to settling timber or shifting foundations. Footsteps in the lobby, deliberate and measured, followed by the scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. I lay frozen in my sleeping bag, listening to the unmistakable sound of someone moving through my building with purpose and familiarity. The footsteps stopped directly below my makeshift bedroom in the old office above the lobby, and I could hear voices, muffled but clearly human, discussing something in tones too low for me to make out words. After about 20 minutes, the sounds faded toward what I thought was the stage door exit, followed by the slam of a door and the roar of a truck engine starting up. The next morning, I found fresh damage in the lobby that hadn't been there the night before. Someone had pried boards off 2 windows, not to gain entry, but seemingly to make the building look more deteriorated than it actually was. Graffiti had appeared on the marble walls, spray-painted tags that looked recent and deliberate. Most disturbing, a section of the original crown molding had been deliberately damaged. Beautiful plasterwork that had survived 90 years of neglect, destroyed in a single night by someone with tools and intent. I called the police, but the responding officer took one look at the condemned building and suggested that vandalism was probably the least of my problems. These old buildings attract all kinds of trouble, he said, filling out a report that I suspected would disappear into some filing cabinet and never be seen again. You might want to consider boarding this place up properly or hiring security. I spent that afternoon installing better locks and a motion-activated security camera system that cost another $800.00 I couldn't afford. While testing the cameras, I discovered something that made my blood cold. The locks on the building weren't just old, they were newer than they should have been. The main entrance had a deadbolt that couldn't have been more than 6 months old, installed with precision and care that suggested professional work. The stage door had similar hardware, and when I examined the windows more carefully, I found that several had been recently reinforced with plywood that didn't match the weathered boards the city had installed during condemnation. Someone else had keys to my building, someone who'd been maintaining access even after the city had officially sealed it. That night, I called Celeste from the relative safety of a coffee shop 3 blocks away, hoping that her legal expertise might help me understand what I'd stumbled into. "You're probably looking at squatters," she said, her voice carrying the weary patience of someone who'd predicted this exact conversation. Condemned buildings attract homeless populations, drug users, people who need shelter and don't respect property boundaries. The locks were probably changed by whoever was using the space before you bought it. Her explanation made sense, but it didn't account for the deliberate nature of the fresh damage or the professional quality of the lock installation. "Aiden, this is exactly what Nathan and I meant about the hidden costs of these properties. You're not just buying a building, you're buying every problem that comes with it. Security, liability, ongoing vandalism, potentially dangerous squatters who think they have more right to be there than you do." I wanted to argue with her assessment, to explain that something about the situation felt more organized than random vandalism or homeless encampment. But as I sat in the coffee shop, looking at the photos I'd taken of the fresh damage, I realized I had no evidence for my suspicions, only the growing certainty that my building purchase had dropped me into the middle of something I didn't understand. The city inspector, Graham Elwood, was scheduled to return in 10 days for his follow-up assessment, and based on the new damage, his report would be even more damning than his original condemnation. Someone was systematically making my building look worse than it was, and I had no idea who they were or why they cared enough to break in and destroy beautiful architectural details that had survived nearly a century. All I knew was that when I'd bought the Paramount Theater, I'd apparently inherited more than just a building. I'd inherited enemies I didn't know I had, and they clearly had keys. The city inspector's follow-up visit was now 8 days away, and my building seemed to be deteriorating faster than physics should have allowed. I'd spent the weekend documenting fresh damage that appeared overnight, photographing spray paint that hadn't been there Friday evening, and broken fixtures that had been intact when I'd left. My savings account had dropped to $31,000, 0 cents, after paying for the security system, emergency electrical repairs to make the building minimally safe for occupancy, and a structural engineer's consultation that had cost $2,800, 0 cents, and resulted in a 20-page report essentially confirming what everyone already knew. The foundation had issues, the roof needed complete replacement, and bringing the building up to modern codes would require gutting most of the interior systems. What the report didn't explain was why someone cared enough to break into my building 3 times in 2 weeks, each time causing damage that seemed calculated to make renovation look more impossible than it already was. My parents had stopped returning my calls with their usual promptness, and when my mother finally called back after 4 days, her voice carried the exhausted tone of someone who'd spent too much time discussing a problem they couldn't solve. "We're worried about you living in that building, Aiden," she said during what felt like a carefully rehearsed conversation. "Your father's been researching the property records, and there are things about this purchase that don't make sense. The previous owner sold it for significantly less than market value, even for a condemned property. The condemnation process was unusually fast, and there were no appeals or attempts to contest the inspector's findings." She paused, and I could hear my father's voice in the background, prompting her with additional concerns. "We think you should consider cutting your losses before the situation gets worse. We've talked to our financial advisor, and he's identified some strategies for minimizing the tax implications of the loss." Celeste had taken a more direct approach, showing up at the building unannounced on a Tuesday morning with Nathan and a manila folder full of what she called reality documentation. They'd brought hard hats and work boots, apparently expecting to conduct some kind of formal inspection. And the sight of my successful sister dressed for construction work felt like performance art designed to highlight how far outside normal parameters my life had drifted. "We've been researching your inspector, Graham Elwood," she announced, pulling out printed copies of city records and inspection reports. "He's condemned 14 buildings in the past 2 years, and 11 of them have been demolished. The 3 that weren't demolished required complete reconstruction that cost more than new construction would have." Nathan spread the documents across a folding table they'd brought, creating an impromptu legal presentation in the middle of my crumbling lobby. The pattern suggests that when Elwood condemns a building, reversal is essentially impossible. His reports are thorough, his recommendations are conservative, and the city council has never overruled one of his safety determinations. The isolation wasn't just financial anymore, it was social. Friends who'd initially expressed polite interest in my project had stopped asking for updates, and invitations to dinners or weekend gatherings had quietly disappeared. I understood their logic. Nobody wanted to spend an evening listening to someone describe the slow-motion destruction of their life savings, especially when that destruction had been entirely predictable and preventable. My former colleagues at Morrison & Associates had heard about the purchase through architecture community gossip, and the few who'd reached out had done so with the careful sympathy usually reserved for career-ending mistakes. "If you ever want to come back," my old supervisor had said during an awkward coffee meeting, "we'd be happy to discuss opportunities. This kind of passion project can be really valuable experience, even when it doesn't work out the way you hope." On Thursday afternoon, while I was trying to photograph water damage in the basement for my insurance claim, I heard footsteps on the main floor that were too heavy and deliberate to belong to another vandalism attempt. I climbed the stairs expecting to find police or city officials, but instead found a man in his 60s examining the lobby's crown molding, with the focused attention of someone who understood what he was looking at. He had thick gray hair, work-worn hands, and was wearing a tool belt that looked like it had seen 30 years of serious use. "You the kid who bought this place?" he asked without turning around. When I confirmed that I was, he nodded toward the damaged plasterwork. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. This molding was installed by craftsmen who don't exist anymore, and it takes skill to destroy it this precisely. This wasn't random vandalism. The man introduced himself as Silas Vega, though he said everyone called him C, and explained that he'd been driving past the building for weeks, watching my attempts to secure and assess the property. He'd spent 40 years as a contractor specializing in historic renovations before retiring, and something about my situation had caught his professional curiosity. "I worked on buildings like this back when there were still people alive who remembered how they were built," he said, running his hand along an original brass fixture that somehow remained intact. "The Paramount was designed by the same architect who did the Majestic Theater in Denver, and that building's worth $12 million today. This place has good bones under all the damage, better bones than most of what gets built now." His assessment felt like the first professionally optimistic opinion I'd heard since buying the building, and I found myself explaining my vision for restoration with an enthusiasm I'd almost forgotten I possessed. C listened without the polite skepticism I'd grown accustomed to, asking technical questions about my research into the building's original specifications and my understanding of historic preservation requirements. "The city's being awfully aggressive about this condemnation," he said after I'd described the timeline of official actions. "Usually there's more back and forth, more opportunity for the owner to address specific violations before they declare the whole structure unsafe. Graham Elwood's a good inspector, careful and thorough, but this feels rushed even for him." He asked to see the condemnation report, and while he read through the technical details, his expression shifted from professional interest to something closer to confusion. "Some of these violations don't match what I'm seeing in the building. The electrical hazards he describes in the basement, for instance, I'm not finding evidence of those specific problems." The city had added 3 new violation notices since my purchase, each one carrying fines that ranged from $500 0 cents to $2,000 0 cents. And requirements for immediate remediation that seemed designed to be impossible to fulfill. The fire department had cited inadequate emergency exits, despite the building having the same configuration it had possessed when it was operating as a theater. The zoning commission had questioned whether my intended use as a cultural center was compatible with downtown commercial designation, requiring me to apply for variance hearings that could take months and cost thousands in legal fees. Most frustrating, the building department had imposed a requirement for updated environmental impact studies, including soil testing and air quality assessments that would cost $15,000 0 cents and take 6 weeks to complete. Each new requirement felt like another shovelful of dirt being thrown on the grave of my project. C offered to help with some of the basic renovation work, not for money, but because he was curious about what we might find once we started peeling back the layers of neglect and modification. "Buildings like this usually have surprises hidden in the walls," he said, tapping the lobby's damaged plasterwork. "Previous owners make changes over the decades, and sometimes they wall off spaces or features instead of removing them. If we're careful about how we approach the restoration, we might discover things that make this project more viable than anyone expects." His willingness to work for free felt like salvation, but it also highlighted how desperate my situation had become. I was grateful for help I couldn't afford from a retired contractor who was willing to gamble his time on my impossible project. That evening, C and I started removing some of the damaged plasterwork in the lobby, working carefully to preserve as much of the original material as possible. We'd been working for about an hour when C's crowbar hit something that wasn't wall. Instead of the solid resistance of studs and plaster, there was a hollow thunk, followed by the sound of something large shifting behind the damaged surface. "Hold on," C said, setting down his tools and running his hands along the wall surface. "This section doesn't feel like the rest. The texture's different, and there's a seam here that's been covered with compound and painted over." He looked at me with the expression of someone who just found something unexpected and potentially significant. "Kid, I think there might be a space back here that nobody's seen in decades." We worked until nearly midnight, carefully removing plaster and lath to reveal what appeared to be a bricked-up doorway, the original opening sealed with bricks that didn't match the rest of the lobby's construction. The mortar was different too, newer than it should have been, suggesting that whatever space lay behind the wall had been deliberately concealed sometime after the building's original construction. He stepped back, wiping plaster dust from his hands, and looked at the hidden doorway with the satisfaction of someone who'd solved a puzzle. "Whatever's back there," he said, "somebody wanted it to stay hidden. Question is why, and whether it matters to your renovation plans." As we packed up our tools, I realized that my condemned building had just revealed its first secret. And for the first time since buying the property, I felt like I might have found something that could change everything. The hidden doorway took us 3 days to open properly, working in the evenings after C finished his part-time consulting jobs and I completed my daily battles with city bureaucracy. We'd decided to document everything carefully, photographing each layer of brick and mortar as we removed it, partly because C's contractor instincts demanded proper procedure, and partly because I had a growing suspicion that whatever we found might matter more than just satisfying our curiosity. The bricks behind the wall were older than the ones used to seal the opening, suggesting that we were uncovering an original architectural feature rather than creating a new passage. The mortar holding the ceiling bricks crumbled easily, confirming C's assessment that the doorway had been closed sometime in the 1940s or 1950s, decades after the building's construction, but long enough ago that the concealment had been forgotten by subsequent owners. When we finally broke through the last layer of brick and shined our flashlights into the space beyond, the beam revealed a room that looked like it had been sealed in time. The space was larger than either of us had expected, perhaps 20 feet by 15 feet, with the same high ceilings and ornate plasterwork as the main lobby. But unlike the rest of the building, this room showed no signs of the water damage, vandalism, or decay that had ravaged the public area. The air smelled of old paper and furniture polish rather than mold and deterioration, and when Cy's flashlight swept across the far wall, we could see built-in shelving lined with books, filing cabinets, and what appeared to be a massive oak desk positioned beneath a window that had been bricked up from the outside. "This was somebody's office," Cy said, his voice carrying the reverence of someone discovering an archaeological site, and whoever used it left in a hurry. The desk was covered with papers that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-tack, as if someone had stepped away for lunch and never returned. Financial ledgers were spread across the leather-top surface, pages filled with handwritten entries in fountain pen ink that had faded to brown but remained legible. The dates on the visible pages ranged from 1923 to 1927, placing them in the early years of the theater's operation, and the monetary amounts were substantial enough to suggest that the Paramount had been a profitable enterprise during its prime. C found a light switch near the door that still worked, apparently connected to a circuit that had been isolated when the room was sealed, and when the overhead fixtures illuminated the space, we could see details that flashlights had missed. Framed photographs lined one wall, showing the theater during its opening night, elegant crowds in evening wear posing beneath the same architectural details we'd been documenting in their current, deteriorated state. I started with the filing cabinets, while Cy examined the books and photographs, both of us moving with the careful attention of people who understood we might be disturbing evidence of something significant. The files were organized with obsessive precision, labeled in the same fountain pen handwriting as the ledgers, and sorted into categories that revealed the complexity of operating a major entertainment venue in the 927. There were contracts with performers, correspondence with distributors, detailed maintenance records for every system in the building, and financial projections that showed the theater generating revenue that seemed impossible for a business that had supposedly failed during the Depression. What made the documents extraordinary wasn't just their preservation, but their content, which painted a picture of a thriving enterprise that had been generating substantial profits right up until the moment it was apparently abandoned. The most intriguing discovery was a leather-bound journal that C found in the desk's locked bottom drawer, a key for which had been hidden behind one of the framed photographs. The journal belonged to Theo Harrow, the theater's original owner and operator, and his entries provided a day-by-day account of the business's operations that read like a thriller rather than typical business records. June 15, 1927, one entry read, Judge Langston visited again today, making his usual suggestions about the profitability of selling to his development consortium. His offer remains insulting, but his tone has shifted from persuasive to threatening. I've begun documenting our conversations and maintaining copies of all correspondence in the secondary location. The reference to a secondary location was intriguing, but more interesting was the name Langston, which matched our current city councilman, Everett Langston, who'd been pressuring the city to accelerate my building's demolition schedule. C found a manila envelope tucked behind the theater construction photographs that contained documents unlike anything else in the office. These were mineral rights surveys and geological assessments dating from 1925, technical reports that described the soil composition and subsurface characteristics of the entire city block. The surveys had been commissioned by Harrow, apparently as part of his research into the long-term value of his property investment, and they revealed something that explained why a theater owner would spend money on geological studies. The land beneath the Paramount Theater sat on top of a natural gas formation that, according to the 1925 assessment, held significant commercial potential for future extraction. The rights to those underground resources were separately owned from the surface property, but the documents showed that Harrow had been negotiating to purchase the mineral rights as part of a long-term investment strategy that would provide revenue even if the theater business eventually declined. The mineral rights contracts were the most explosive discovery in the hidden office. Harrow had successfully purchased the underground extraction rights for the entire city block in 1926, paying $50,000, 0 cents, for privileges that the geological survey suggested could be worth millions if natural gas prices increased or extraction technology improved. But the contracts had never been officially filed with the county, apparently because Harrow had died unexpectedly in 1928, and his estate had been handled by lawyers who either didn't understand the significance of the mineral rights or had been instructed to keep them confidential. According to the documentation in the hidden office, legal ownership of the underground resources beneath my building had never been transferred to subsequent surface property owners, meaning that the rights still belonged to Harrow's estate and could potentially be claimed by anyone who could prove legitimate succession. I was photographing the mineral rights contracts when C called me over to examine something he'd found in the bottom filing cabinet drawer. The folder was labeled Legal Correspondence Confidential and contained letters between Harrow and various lawyers, judges, and city officials that read like evidence of a conspiracy. Judge Ambrose Langston, who I now realize must be Everett's grandfather, had apparently been pressuring Harrow to sell the theater property for significantly less than its assessed value, using his judicial position to create legal obstacles that would force a quick sale. March 3, 1927, one letter read, Judge Langston has indicated that my property tax assessment will be reviewed for potential increases unless I reconsider the consortium's purchase offer. His son has also begun citing the theater for minor code violations that seem designed to create operating difficulties rather than address legitimate safety concerns. The correspondence painted a picture of systematic official harassment designed to force Harrow into selling his profitable business to the Langston family's development consortium. The final folder in the filing cabinet contained documents that made my hands shake as I read them. These were modern papers, obviously placed in the hidden office sometime in the past few years rather than dating from the 1920s. Someone had been researching the same mineral rights and legal ownership questions that Harrow's original documents addressed, using contemporary legal databases and geological surveys to assess the current value of the underground resources. The modern assessment concluded that the natural gas formation beneath the theater block could be worth upward of $15 million 0 cents using current extraction methods, and that the mineral rights ownership question remained legally unresolved due to the incomplete estate processing after Harrow's death. Most disturbing, the contemporary research had been conducted by a law firm that I recognized from recent city correspondence, the same legal practice that had been handling the expedited demolition proceedings for my building. C and I worked until nearly dawn, photographing every document and creating a complete inventory of the hidden office's contents. As we prepared to seal the room temporarily to protect our discovery, I realized that my condemned building purchase had accidentally placed me in the middle of a conspiracy that had been running for almost a century. The Langston family had apparently been trying to acquire this property since the 1920s, using official pressure and legal manipulation to force sales that would give them access to mineral rights worth millions. My building wasn't condemned because it was structurally unsound. It was condemned because someone needed to clear the title before they could claim the underground resources that Theo Harrow had legally purchased but never officially recorded. As I locked up the building that morning, I understood why someone had been breaking in to create additional damage, why the condemnation process had been rushed, and why Councilman Everett Langston had been pushing for immediate demolition. They couldn't claim the mineral rights while the building still had an owner who might discover the hidden office and its documentation of legal ownership. But they also couldn't risk leaving the building intact long enough for someone to research the property's history thoroughly. The break-ins weren't random vandalism. They were systematic attempts to ensure that my renovation project would fail before I could discover what Theo Harrow had hidden behind that bricked-up doorway. And now that I knew what was buried beneath my building, Graham Elwood's follow-up inspection, scheduled for tomorrow morning, had become something much more significant than a routine condemnation review. Graham Elwood arrived at exactly 9:00 a.m. for his follow-up inspection, carrying the same clipboard and wearing the same expression of professional skepticism I remembered from our first meeting. But this time, I was ready for him. C and I had spent the night preparing, photographing the recent vandalism damage alongside the original architectural features, documenting the discrepancies between the official condemnation report and the building's actual structural condition, and most importantly, researching Graham's inspection history through public records that painted a troubling pattern. Over the past 3 years, every building Graham had condemned in the downtown district had eventually been purchased by development companies, connected to Councilman Everett Langston's business interests, often for prices that seemed suspiciously low given the prime real estate locations involved. I had expected Graham to conduct a perfunctory walkthrough, confirm his previous assessment, and file paperwork that would move my building into the demolition queue within 30 days. Instead, he spent nearly 4 hours examining details that hadn't appeared in his original report, taking measurements and photographs that suggested a level of thoroughness I hadn't anticipated. When he reached the lobby area where C and I had uncovered the hidden doorway, his behavior shifted from professional routine to something closer to personal concern. "This wall has been recently disturbed," he said, examining our careful excavation work. "Did you have permits for structural modifications?" I explained that we'd been removing vandalism damage and had discovered what appeared to be an original architectural feature that had been sealed sometime after construction. Graham studied the exposed doorway for several minutes, his expression unreadable, before making notes that were longer and more detailed than anything he'd written during the rest of his inspection. After Graham completed his assessment and left without offering any indication of his conclusions, I called the one person I thought might help me understand what had just happened. Jasper Ito worked for the State Historical Preservation Office, and we'd met during my research into the building's architectural significance. He was my age, passionate about protecting historic structures, and had expressed genuine interest in the Paramount's potential for restoration when I'd first described my project. "Graham Elwood just spent 4 hours re-inspecting my building," I told him over the phone. "His behavior was completely different from the original condemnation visit, and I think something might have changed about the official assessment." Jasper was quiet for a moment before responding with news that I hadn't expected. "That's interesting timing. I've been researching your building's historical status for a potential landmark designation, and I found some documentation that suggests the original condemnation might have been based on incomplete information." Jasper had discovered that the Paramount Theater appeared on a preliminary list of structures being considered for National Historic Register designation, a status that would significantly complicate any demolition proceedings and require extensive review of renovation alternatives before condemnation could be finalized. More importantly, his research had uncovered discrepancies in the official inspection timeline that raised questions about the legitimacy of the condemnation process. Buildings can't be condemned and demolished while they're under active consideration for historic protection, he explained. If someone rushed the condemnation process to circumvent historic preservation review, that could invalidate the entire proceeding. He asked if I would be willing to meet with him to discuss the building's historical significance and review the documents I'd found in the hidden office, particularly any materials that might support a landmark designation application. That afternoon, Jasper and I spent 3 hours in Theo Harrow's preserved office, examining the photographs, correspondence, and construction documents that painted a detailed picture of the theater's cultural and architectural importance during the 1920s. Jasper was particularly excited about the original blueprint modifications and construction photographs, which showed design details that had been lost or modified over subsequent decades. This documentation proves that the Paramount was more architecturally significant than anyone realized, he said, photographing pages from Harrow's construction journals. The original interior was designed by craftsmen who worked on some of the most important theaters in the country, and if we can demonstrate that those original features are still intact beneath the damage, we have a strong case for historic protection. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time since buying the building, I felt like I had an expert ally who understood both the challenges and the potential of my project. The mineral rights documentation fascinated Jasper for reasons beyond historical preservation. As someone who'd worked on numerous cases involving development pressure on historic properties, he recognized the pattern of official harassment that Harrow's correspondence described. This kind of systematic pressure to force property sales was common in the 1920s and 1930s, he said, reading through Judge Langston's threatening letters. What's unusual is finding such detailed documentation of the conspiracy, and what's extraordinary is that the same family appears to be using similar tactics today. He pointed out that if we could prove the current condemnation was motivated by the same desire to acquire the property for development that had driven the harassment in Harrow's time, we might be able to challenge the proceeding as a continuation of historic corruption rather than legitimate safety oversight. 2 days after Graham's inspection, I received a phone call that I initially thought was someone playing an elaborate prank. "Mr. Mori, this is Graham Elwood from the City Building Inspection Department. I need to schedule a meeting to discuss my assessment of your property." His tone was formal but not hostile, carrying none of the dismissive certainty I'd expected from someone about to confirm my building's demolition sentence. When I asked if he wanted to meet at the building, he suggested his office instead, explaining that he preferred to discuss his findings in a setting where our conversation wouldn't be interrupted or overheard. The request for privacy struck me as unusual for what should have been a straightforward delivery of inspection results, and I wondered if Graham's 4-hour examination had revealed something that complicated his expected conclusion. Graham's office was smaller than I'd anticipated, a cramped space filled with filing cabinets, technical manuals, and photographs of buildings in various stages of construction and demolition. He gestured for me to sit across from his desk, then opened a thick folder that I assumed contained his assessment of my property. "Mr. Mori, I need to be honest with you about something," he began, his voice carrying a weight that suggested this conversation would be more significant than I'd prepared for. "My original condemnation of your building was based on inspection parameters that I now realize were inadequate. I was instructed to focus on specific types of violations and to complete the assessment within a time frame that didn't allow for comprehensive structural analysis." He paused, looking directly at me with an expression that seemed to carry years of accumulated professional regret. "After examining the building more thoroughly, I don't believe it meets the criteria for condemnation that I applied in my original report." The admission hit me like physical impact, the sudden realization that my family's warnings, my financial panic, and my months of isolation had been based on a deliberately flawed official assessment. Graham continued, explaining that his recent inspection had revealed structural integrity that contradicted his original findings, building systems that were old but functional rather than dangerously compromised, and architectural features that had been preserved rather than destroyed by decades of neglect. "The water damage and vandalism are cosmetic problems that can be addressed during renovation," he said, referring to his detailed notes. "The foundation issues I cited in my original report appear to have been caused by a temporary drainage problem that was resolved years ago. The electrical and mechanical systems need updating to meet current codes, but they don't pose the immediate safety threats that justified emergency condemnation. His revised assessment meant that my building could be legally occupied and renovated, that the demolition timeline could be suspended, and that I'd been living through months of financial and emotional crisis because of an inspection that had been conducted improperly from the beginning. Graham's willingness to reverse his condemnation was extraordinary, but his explanation of why the original assessment had been flawed was more troubling than the good news was relieving. I've been getting pressure from city council members to expedite certain condemnation proceedings, he admitted, his discomfort with the admission obvious in his body language. Councilman Langston has been particularly interested in buildings that he considers obstacles to downtown development, and he's made it clear that thorough inspections that delay demolition are not appreciated by the administration. Graham had apparently reached a point where his professional integrity mattered more than political pressure, and his decision to correct his original assessment represented a level of courage that I hadn't expected from a city bureaucrat who'd seemed completely unsympathetic during our first meeting. As I prepared to leave Graham's office with official documentation that my building was no longer condemned, he offered a warning that tempered my relief with new anxiety. Councilman Langston isn't going to be happy about this reversal, and he has influence with other city departments that handle permits, zoning, and development approvals. You should expect that your renovation project will face increased scrutiny and that bureaucratic obstacles will appear that might not be entirely legitimate. He suggested that I document every interaction with city offices, maintain detailed records of all permit applications and responses, and consider consulting with lawyers who specialized in municipal law if the resistance to my project escalated beyond normal regulatory oversight. You've won this battle, he said as I gathered the paperwork that officially restored my building's legal status. But the war for this property started long before you bought it, and it's not going to end just because I corrected my inspection report. That evening, I called Celeste to share the news that my condemned building was no longer condemned, expecting that my family's relief would override their lingering skepticism about my judgment. Instead, Celeste's response carried a caution that I hadn't anticipated from someone who'd spent months arguing that I should abandon the project. Well, this is good news, Aiden, but it raises questions about why the building was condemned in the first place. If the inspector was pressured to rush his assessment, and if city council members were influencing inspection procedures, you might be dealing with corruption that goes beyond your individual property. She offered to research the legal implications of Graham's admission and to connect me with colleagues who specialized in municipal corruption cases, but she also warned that challenging city officials would require resources and stamina that might exceed what I could afford as an individual property owner trying to fund a renovation project. As I walked through my no longer condemned building that night, documenting the architectural details that Graham's revised inspection had officially recognized as preservable, I realized that discovering Theo Harrow's hidden office had given me more than historical documentation. It had provided a roadmap for the kind of systematic pressure that I could expect as Councilman Langston escalated his efforts to acquire my property. The break-ins would probably continue, the bureaucratic obstacles would multiply, and the isolation from family and friends would intensify as my project became more obviously a target of official harassment. But I also had something that Theo Harrow had never possessed during his fight with Judge Langston in the 1920. Allies who understood the historical and legal significance of what I'd uncovered, and documentation that could prove the corruption was a continuation of crimes that had been hidden for almost a century. The battle for my building was just beginning. But for the first time since buying the property, I felt like I had weapons that might be adequate for the fight ahead. Graham Elwood's official reversal of the condemnation created a bureaucratic chaos that rippled through City Hall within hours of the paperwork being filed. I spent Tuesday morning at the permits office, trying to submit applications for renovation work that should have been routine, only to discover that my building had somehow acquired new violations overnight that hadn't existed during Graham's inspection. The fire marshal's office had issued citations for emergency exit deficiencies that directly contradicted Graham's assessment of the building's egress systems. The zoning department had flagged my intended use as a cultural center for compatibility review that would require hearings before boards that apparently met only monthly and were booked solid for the next 6 months. Most frustrating. The Environmental Health Department had imposed a requirement for soil contamination testing that would cost $18,000, 0 cents, and take 8 weeks to complete, based on the building's proximity to a dry cleaning business that had operated across the street in the 1970s. Each new obstacle came with documentation that looked official and legitimate, signed by department heads and stamped with proper seals, but the timing was too convenient and the requirements too expensive to be coincidental. I was photographing the latest violation notices when my phone rang with a call from Maya Dillon, a reporter from the city's alternative weekly newspaper, who'd been researching patterns in downtown development and demolition. "I've been following your building's condemnation reversal," she said, "and your situation fits into a story I've been investigating about questionable inspection practices and development pressure. Would you be willing to discuss what you've experienced with the permit process and any pressure you might have encountered from city officials?" The idea of media attention made me nervous, but Maya's questions suggested that my problems with Councilman Langston weren't isolated incidents and that other property owners might have faced similar systematic harassment. Maya arrived at the building that afternoon with a photographer and a folder full of research that painted a disturbing picture of Councilman Langston's development activities over the past 5 years. She'd identified 12 properties in the downtown area that had been condemned, demolished, and subsequently sold to development companies connected to Langston's business interests, often for prices that seemed suspiciously low given their prime locations. "The pattern is consistent enough to suggest coordination," she explained, showing me property records and inspection timelines that revealed similarities to my own experience. Buildings get condemned quickly. Owners face expensive compliance requirements that make renovation economically impossible, and within months the properties are sold to developers who seem to have advanced knowledge of the condemnation proceedings. Her investigation had uncovered financial relationships between Langston and several of the development companies, suggesting that the councilman had been profiting from his influence over the condemnation process. The most damning evidence Maya had collected involved Graham Elwood's inspection history, which showed a dramatic change in his condemnation rate after Langston joined the city council 3 years earlier. Before Langston's election, Graham condemned maybe 2 or 3 buildings per year, and most of those were genuine safety hazards in residential neighborhoods, Maya said, referring to her analysis of public records. Since 2020, he's been condemning 4 or 5 commercial buildings annually, and almost all of them are in the downtown development corridor that Langston has identified as a priority for modernization. Graham's willingness to reverse my condemnation was apparently unprecedented in his recent history, representing the first time he'd admitted that one of his assessments had been inadequate or improperly influenced. Jasper had spent the week researching the mineral rights documentation we'd found in Theo Harrow's office, working with lawyers who specialized in property law and mineral extraction to assess the legal validity of the claims. His findings were extraordinary enough that he'd driven down from the state capitol to deliver them in person, rather than discussing them over the phone. "The mineral rights under your building are legitimate and legally enforceable," he announced, spreading copies of contemporary geological surveys across Harrow's preserved desk. "Modern extraction technology makes the natural gas formation commercially viable, and current market prices would make the rights worth approximately $12 million, 0 cents, if properly developed." More importantly, his legal research had confirmed that the rights had never been legally transferred to subsequent property owners, meaning that they technically still belonged to Harrow's estate and could be claimed by anyone who could prove legitimate succession or purchase them from the estate's legal representatives. The implications of the mineral rights discovery extended far beyond my individual property, potentially affecting several city blocks in the downtown development corridor that Councilman Langston had been targeting for redevelopment. Jasper's research suggested that if other buildings in the area sat on similar geological formations, the systematic condemnation and demolition of historic properties might have been motivated by efforts to clear title for mineral extraction rather than legitimate urban planning. If we can prove that Langston has been using his official position to condemn buildings in order to access underground resources, we're looking at conspiracy charges and federal corruption violations, Jasper said, his excitement obvious despite the serious legal implications. "This could be the smoking gun that exposes the entire development scheme and potentially reverse years of questionable condemnation proceedings." That evening, while Jasper, Maya, and I were examining the evidence we'd assembled, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Offer expires tonight. $800, 0 cents, K-cash, for immediate sale. No contingencies. Property sold as is." The message was followed by contact information for a real estate attorney who I didn't recognize, representing a buyer who wasn't identified. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental, coming just hours after Maya had interviewed me about development pressure and immediately following Jasper's confirmation of the mineral rights value. Someone had been monitoring our activities closely enough to know that we'd discovered information that made my property significantly more valuable, and they were making a preemptive offer that was double my purchase price, but probably a fraction of the property's true worth, including mineral rights. I showed the text to Jasper and Maya, both of whom recognized the message as confirmation that our investigation had attracted attention from the people we were investigating. "They're panicking," Maya said, photographing the message for her story. "If they're offering $800 0 K without negotiation for a property you bought for $400 0 K 6 months ago, they know something about its value that they don't want you to discover." Jasper was more concerned about the offer expires tonight deadline, which suggested that whoever was behind the purchase attempt wanted to complete the transaction before we could file the mineral rights claim or publish Maya's investigation. "This feels like a last-ditch effort to acquire the property before the legal situation becomes too complicated for them to navigate," he said. "If you don't sell tonight, they're probably going to escalate to more aggressive tactics." I called Celeste to discuss the purchase offer, expecting that she would advise me to take the money and walk away from a situation that was becoming increasingly complex and potentially dangerous. Instead, her response surprised me with its strategic sophistication. "Don't respond to the text," she said immediately. "If they're offering $800 0 K without inspection or contingencies, the property is worth significantly more than that, and accepting their offer would probably give them exactly what they've been trying to steal through the condemnation process." She explained that Nathan's law firm had been researching municipal corruption cases and that my situation might represent the kind of systematic abuse of official authority that could result in substantial damage awards if we could prove the pattern of illegal behavior. "You need to document everything, preserve all the evidence you've found, and consider that this might be bigger than just your individual property rights." As midnight approached and the purchase offer deadline passed without response from me, I received a series of increasingly aggressive text messages from the same unknown number. "Final warning, property acquisition will proceed with or without cooperation. Building inspection irregularities will be reported to state authorities. Fire safety violations require immediate evacuation." The messages were clearly intended to intimidate, but they also revealed desperation from people who had apparently exhausted their official channels for forcing me to sell. Maya photographed each message, explaining that intimidation tactics often became evidence in corruption investigations and that threatening property owners was a federal crime when it involved abuse of official authority. The final message arrived at 12:47 a.m. and its content made my blood run cold. "Building safety cannot be guaranteed. Accidents happen during renovation projects." The threat was subtle enough to provide legal deniability, but clear enough to be unmistakable, and it marked a fundamental escalation from bureaucratic harassment to personal intimidation. Jasper immediately called his contacts at the State Attorney General's office, explaining that we had evidence of municipal corruption and that threats were being made against a property owner who had discovered documentation of the illegal activity. "This crosses the line from local politics into state and federal jurisdiction," he said after completing the call. "When city officials start making threats against citizens who uncover corruption, it becomes a civil rights violation that state and federal prosecutors take very seriously." I spent that night in a hotel rather than the building, partly because the threat had genuinely frightened me, but mostly because Jasper and Maya had convinced me that my safety was less important than preserving the evidence we'd collected. If something happened to me, the mineral rights documentation, the historical correspondence, and the modern evidence of corruption would disappear, along with any chance of holding Councilman Langston accountable for decades of systematic theft. "They've been running this scheme for almost a century," Maya said as we secured copies of all the documents in multiple locations. "They're not going to stop just because one property owner discovered their operation. But they also can't afford to let this evidence become public, which means they're going to get more dangerous before this is over." As I checked into the hotel room, I realized that my simple building purchase had evolved into something far more significant than a renovation project. I was now in possession of evidence that could expose corruption dating back to the 1920s, prove that city officials had been systematically stealing property through abuse of condemnation authority, and potentially recover millions of dollars in illegally acquired assets. But I was also in physical danger from people who had demonstrated their willingness to use official power for personal gain and who had just escalated to direct threats against my safety. Tomorrow, Maya's story would be published, exposing the corruption to public scrutiny and hopefully providing protection through media attention. But tonight, lying awake in an anonymous hotel room, I understood that Councilman Langston's final, desperate move was just beginning, and that the real battle for my building and the mineral rights beneath it was about to begin.